So good afternoon and welcome to the Rudman Center and the Presidency in Real Time, a conversation with the Presidential Chiefs of Staff. The historian Richard Norton Smith has said, every president reveals himself by the portraits he hangs in the Roosevelt Room and the person he chooses as Chief of Staff. This afternoon, we're fortunate to have three distinguished former chiefs, great public servants, who served three two-term presidents. Ken Duberstein began his public service on Capitol Hill as an assistant to Senator Jacob K. Javits. He was a key member of Ronald Reagan's administration, serving as assistant to the president for legislative affairs. In the aftermath of the Iran-Contra scandal, as Deputy Chief of Staff Howard Baker Jr., he helped put the administration back on track, and in July of 1988, he was appointed as Reagan's last Chief of Staff. Thomas Mack McLarty has had a distinguished record of business leadership and public service, including various roles advising three U.S. presidents: Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Jimmy Carter. As President Clinton's White House Chief of Staff, Mr. McLarty helped enact the historic 1993 Deficit Reduction Package, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Family and Medical Leave Law, and the landmark welfare reform legislation. Andrew Card served in President Reagan's administration as Special Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs and subsequently as Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. He was Secretary of Transportation under President George H.W. Bush and Assistant to the President and Deputy Chief of Staff. Under George W. Bush, Mr. Card became the second longest Chief of Staff in modern history, lasting more than 5 years in a job where the average tenure is about 18 months, and we're about to find out why. Welcome, gentlemen, and let's get started with a look at you in action from the documentary, The President's Gatekeepers.
You got to kind of get up pretty early to beat the president to the punch here, that's for sure.
The average day for me would start at 5:30 in the morning.
I get up at 5.
4:30, 5 in the morning. Read 5 newspapers as quickly as I could to get a feel for what was going on in the world. Go to the White House.
We've got a lot to cover today.
I'd meet with the CIA briefer. Then you'd meet with the foreign policy team, the economic policy team. Then you'd meet with the White House staff. Then you'd have a larger meeting to talk about what you were going to try to get accomplished that particular day. In an average day, you would deal with things like Bosnia, Northern Ireland, the budget, taxation, the environment. Then you'd have lunch.
You have a lunch probably with the vice president, your announcement of policy or whatever you're doing that day.
Get to work.
You go on, running from the president's office down to the national security briefing on any one foreign policy issues or questions. You got to get a lot of work done. There's bipartisan meetings that you'll have over at the Hill.
We have to have the meeting today.
You're meeting with the staff, you're returning phone calls, trying to get something done on behalf of the president. Is there anything breaking on the news? Is there a call the president or you have to make to a senator or a House member to move something? So while you're in a meeting with the president, the left side of your brain is usually operating on what's going on in the Hill or in the press. Somewhere around 6:30, you have a wrap up with the president. He goes home and has dinner. You finish up around 7:30 in the office.
You checked the staff secretary's office one last time.
You go home and you're on the phone on the way home, on the phone during dinner, on the phone while you're reading to your kids at sleep, and you fall asleep before the book ends.
So, a typical day. Mack McLarty, let's begin with you. You called the job West Wing without a script. What did you mean by that?
Well, Chris, first of all, let me say that I am just pleased and honored to be part of this session here at the University of New Hampshire, in particular at the Rudman Center. Senator Rudman was special, ferocious integrity, and a man of the middle, as he called it, which I always identified with, and we need that kind of leadership so badly today. So, Margaret, it's good to be with you and President Huddleston and Justice Broderick. It is West Wing without a script. And I think a comment made there about we've got a lot of work to do today. The breadth of the issues of Chief of Staff, coming from the private sector as I did, and now a fourth-generation family business and being Chief Executive of a Fortune 100 company, What struck me about the job was the breadth of the issues, and surprisingly in government compared to the private sector, Chris, the speed in which you had to make decisions, a lot of which were driven by the press and the news cycle, which has only, of course, gotten more accelerated. But that was the two things of the job. It is a wind tunnel, without a question. And not making a decision is making a decision, and you just have to move forward every day.
Ken, you were actually a consultant on the West Wing. How does the reality compare to the fiction?
Well, what I'm struck with, I was hired for 3 years to do storyline and accuracy on West Wing. And I went out to Hollywood, and I met with 7 writers, none of whom was older than 35, and only 2 of the 7 had ever been in Washington. You talk about bright, talented people. After our first long session, I said I had to go back to Washington. And this young, very pretty female writer got up and gave me a hug. And one of the male writers turned to me and said, "Do you know how lucky you are? She's never kissed a Republican before in her life." West Wing has all the glitz, but not necessarily all the hard work. It is action central, as Mack talked about. It is nonstop. Watching the little film clip, the only problem I kept thinking about was Rom saying he went home at 7:30. That's the time we used to go to lunch. You're lucky to get home at 11 o'clock or 11:30, and you get up again, as Andy suggested, at 5 o'clock in the morning. That is not portrayed on West Wing. West Wing looks very hectic and very disheveled. The White House is quieter, more disciplined, and things get done regularly with a lot of balls in the air. In fact, I would suggest that West Wing, there were a lot of balls in the air. In the White House, there are a lot of butterflies in the air. And you don't know when they're going to land, where they're going to go. They're going to go sideways, down, up. That would be my answer to your question. But let me also say how pleased and honored I am to be part of this program today. It's especially nice to be in New Hampshire and not in December, January, early February, in every 4 years. But also to say that Warren Rudman was not only a dear friend of mine, in many ways he taught me so much. When I was at the White House, he was on the Hill, and then in subsequent years, when we were both out of government, doing a lot of things together. So it's really an honor. And John, thanks for inviting us.
Andy Card, I wonder if you could try to define the job for us and the various hats the chief has to wear. I mean, you've said that your job is to make sure that the president is never hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, I think. Tell us about that.
The president had to make decisions that frequently were not anticipated, and sometimes they had to be in the middle of the night or early in the morning or late afternoon, and I did not want him to be hungry, angry, lonely, or tired when he made those tough decisions. So I paid a lot of attention to his psychology. Now, speaking of psychology, Maine is where I like to hang out during the summertime. I've spent a lot of time in New Hampshire, and you have an interesting psychology in New Hampshire that has produced some phenomenal leaders, and obviously Warren Rudman is one of those leaders, and he had a great influence in my life because he did help give definition to where safe middle is, and he produced results that made a difference for this country that lasted literally a generation, with the Rudman-Hollings effort to bring discipline to our budgeting, which the first President Bush then embraced and carried forward, that gave discipline to Congress. But he did so much more than that, including helping to introduce John Sununu to the rest of us. And that introduction changed a lot of people. It also allowed a president to serve, I think, the most successful one-term presidency of anyone in history, and that was the first President Bush. and John Sununu deserves a lot of credit. So I want to give John Broderick credit for allowing us to be here, and the Rudman Center for creating a climate where we could come, the University of New Hampshire, the folks out at Dartmouth, and the Rockefeller Center. But most of all, I say thank you to New Hampshire for helping to produce political leaders that make a difference and have been doing it for a long time. When it comes to the White House responsibilities are really pretty simple to define, especially for a chief of staff. And I'm going to take what a professor at Harvard has said is the definition of the responsibility. It's the care and feeding of the president, policy formulation, and then marketing and selling. The care and feeding ends up being the biggest job of the chief of staff because you worry about the president 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And it does relate to limousines and planes and trains and automobiles and everything in between. Pencil, paper. You don't want the president to worry about the simple things in life. He should worry about the toughest things in political and government life. So the care and feeding is really important, and chiefs of staff are the caregivers to the president. Policy formulation is what you argue about all the time. And that takes place at all of your dinner tables, in the classroom, and at the White House. And the president has to listen to the debate, make decisions, and it's the chief of staff job to make sure that the debates are relevant, that they're timely, and that the president does not waste his time with debates. Everybody at the White House wants to debate all the time. So it's managing the personality of the policymakers or policy advisors and helping them be disciplined about introducing the president to tough decisions where there aren't easy answers, but giving the president the breadth of knowledge to make a decision that will be right, which means a president has to be optimistic. He can't be a pessimist. He has to think that he's going to make the right decision, even though the decisions are impossibly tough. That's the policy side of the responsibility. Finally, if the president makes a decision and nobody knows about it, did the president make a decision? And the truth is the decisions are so tough, they're usually made after a lot of meetings, a lot of reading, a lot of prayer, hopefully a good night's sleep, and the president walks into the Oval Office and the chief of staff greets him, "Top of the morning, Mr. President," because you want him to be in a good mood. And he says, "I made my decision." And he tells you the decision, and he's done with it. The chief of staff then has the responsibility to communicate the decision to people who don't like it, including some White House staffers, because they advise differently. So that's marketing and selling, and that's the job of a chief of staff, and that's what I try to do every day for about 5.5 years.
I would only make one asterisk on Andy's brilliant definition. It's the care and feeding, not only of the president, but also the First Lady.
Yes.
From my standpoint, your standpoint definitely, and yours as well, because they are the people, the person who's closest to the president. I never hung up on Nancy Reagan.
Don Regan did.
Mistake.
Did not live to tell the tale. So presidents have different styles, clearly. Now, when you said that when George W. Bush made a decision, it was done. That wasn't always the case with Bill Clinton.
That's true.
Sometimes Bill Clinton's decisions were not necessarily final. But let's take a look at a clip, because no president needed a confidant more than Bill Clinton. And let's take a look at the next clip.
It's usually the chief who wakes the president in the middle of the night, but the famously nocturnal Clinton turned the tables.
He woke me up a lot. Even when I wasn't working with him. If it was after 11 o'clock at night, the phone rang, I knew it was probably Bill Clinton.
It was about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I get a call from the president. And I said, "Holy cow, what's going on?" And he said, "Leon, are you watching Fritz Hollings on C-SPAN?" I said, "Are you kidding me, Mr. President?" I said, "Nobody in the country is watching Fritz Hollings on C-SPAN right now. Everybody's asleep, and you should be asleep too."
With President Clinton, those calls didn't always require an answer. What he was doing was thinking through a problem, and he wanted to have somebody he trusted who wouldn't go blab about it, just listen.
Mack, can you tell us about the challenges and the rewards of being Chief of Staff to Bill Clinton?
There were both. There were both. I think a couple of points, Chris, that are relevant. One, any Chief of Staff does serve at the pleasure of the President. And I think you put your finger on it. I think each president obviously has a very different personality, style of management, style of leadership. And that's how he has chosen his Chief of Staff, and at various points in times in his presidency, I might add. Additionally, I think with President Clinton, as Ambassador Schumacher knows, you had a timing where, at least when I was privileged to serve as Chief of Staff, he was coming from the campaign to the White House after 12 years of another party occupying the White House. So you had a major transition of getting a government in place, as well as your legislative agenda the first 100 days. So that's a very different period. I think also different, perhaps, I've thought about this from President Reagan and to some extent President Bush 43. Bill Clinton was a centrist. He was a New Democrat. So some of his positions on issues were not quite as definite, perhaps, as President Reagan or President Bush 43's. And he also largely was a problem solver and a deal maker in a good sense, to find the middle ground, compromise ground. So he was always kind of searching for that best answer to get as much as where he wanted to be, and that in and of itself, given particularly the way he looked and evaluated issues and problems, would lend to some of this give and take, exactly what you said. But in the end, if you look at the policy, you look at the results, and you look at the politics, proved to be pretty successful.
Andy, tell us about, there's clearly one of the most important things a chief has to do is to tell the president what he doesn't want to hear. Why don't we actually play a clip? This took place on September 11th, 2001, just after the president and his staff scrambled aboard Air Force One.
And we're flying in a serpentine way, waiting for fighter jets to come up and protect us. And the whole time, the president is telling me we're going back to Washington. The Secret Service is telling me we can't go back there until we know much more about what's happening. You know, President Bush was adamant. He even used terms like, I am the President of the United States. And I was trying to be cool, calm, and objective. And I had the Secret Service very firm with me. I had the President of the United States very firm with me. And I just said, Mr. President, I really can't recommend that. We have to know more about the nature of the attacks and if others are coming. He was firm with me, and yes, he was yelling at me. He was yelling at me. And I just said, I really can't recommend that.
Andy, how difficult was that to defy?
It was difficult. I've had other difficult days. And the actual term that I used with him, I said, Mr. President, I don't think you really want to make that decision right now. And he kept saying, I'm making the decision. We're going back. I don't think you want to make that decision, Mr. President. The pilot of Air Force One was adamant that he wasn't going to land the plane at Andrews, even if he was told he had to. But it was a firm time, and the president was very angry with me. I did stand my ground, but I tried to be inclusive rather than exclusive in talking with him. By the way, the Secret Service did nothing to protect me. They protected him, even though they agreed with me. And I found that there are many times when you're expected to give the president unvarnished counsel that is as objective as it can be, knowing that it's presented during an emotional debate. And that's one of the jobs of a chief of staff. I was fortunate that I had witnessed how other chiefs of staff had done their job. I worked for every chief of staff scenario that served President Reagan. I worked for the first President Bush and saw John Sununu do a great job, and then Sam Skinner do a job, and then Jim Baker do a job. And I had the benefit of watching these great chiefs of staff And then the benefit of understanding what Mack did and Leon Panetta and others with President Clinton before I became Chief of Staff. So I went in with my eyes wide open. I had a goal to be a Chief of Staff where no one knew his name, knowing that some other Chiefs of Staff, everybody knew their name, and it usually wasn't good. And I wanted to be an invisible Chief of Staff. September 11th, 2001 changed that, but the unvarnished counsel to a president is critical every day. And I found that it doesn't take a lot of courage to do it. It takes a lot of courage to practice it. Because if you're only unvarnished in the conversations, then the expectation is that every conversation will be unvarnished. And that means the president doesn't like seeing you. So you do have to understand the psychology of the individual in the office as well as the responsibilities that come with it.
There's a reason that everybody, with the exception of Erskine Bowles, who served as Chief of Staff, is 5'9". We all started at 6'4". You know, everybody walks into the Oval Office, or most people do, and they get cotton in their mouth. They tell the president what they think the president wants to know. Your job is to tell him what he needs to know. Everybody walks into the Oval Office and says, Mr. President, this is why it's in your best interest to do this or that. Our job is to figure out why it's in that person's best interest first, and the president's second. I've, as Chris mentioned, referred to our job as being a reality therapist. Your job is to be the reality person, to tell the president, not so fast. That decision doesn't have to be made right now. We need more options. We need to start thinking through this, and I want to do some more staff planning. I think we need to hear directly from a cabinet secretary. Let him weigh in directly with you. Reagan was very good when people were together and listening to people debate. But the Chief of Staff job was to make sure that he had those points of view and then could make the right decision. Sometimes, as Andy suggested, presidents lose their temper. I'm the president. I want to decide this. No, you really don't want to, because this decision looks easy. But the next 5 forks in the road, there's no acceptable alternatives. You don't want to get on that road. It's the way we all wind up approaching it. So we're not telling the president, hell no, but we're giving him reasons to either let's let some time ripen, let's decisions down the road, or let's hold off and get better options, and let's see a few more people before we rush into a decision.
I want to put this question to all three of you. James Baker famously talked Ronald Reagan out of polygraphing his entire cabinet when he was distressed by a leak. And he turned his car around and went bolting into the Oval Office and said, Mr. President, you can't do this. Did any of you ever have to talk the president out of a dumb idea?
It's none of your business.
This sounds familiar.
They were good ideas that weren't timely.
Right, exactly.
Yes, we did, and we're glad we did.
And you know you're not getting any examples.
That's it.
I thought maybe I'd try again. Okay.
But Chris, I think that goes to build on a point that both Ken and Andy have made. I think it's essential that the president have a trust and an ease with his chief of staff. It's still a human relationship at the end of the day. And so if you're going to be able to offer constructive criticism or the reality check, or to really say, no, we can't do this right now for these reasons, and know how to approach that, unless you have that kind of trust and respect, you're just not going to be effective. So I think that's a key ingredient here that just cannot be emphasized enough.
Let me build on that for a second. I think all three of us had conversations with our president saying, we're not writing a book. The advice we give you is with you and nobody else. your comments to us or to me will stay with me. I'm not going back to my office to dictate something or write down notes. It is that trusting relationship that is fundamental to helping the president do the kind of job that the president needs to do.
Full disclosure, George W. Bush wrote in his book about that incident on Air Force One before I started talking about it. And he did apologize.
How many days did it take?
Months.
But he did apologize.
The chief of staff is often present at the hinge of history, and I'd like to play one more clip for all of you to react to.
The speech came to my desk because I had the final chop before it went to the Oval. And it was flagged that the State Department objected to a paragraph in the speech. The next day, I got a phone call from George Shultz, then the Secretary of State, telling me that he shared the department's objection and would I please tell the president. I knew it was now all on my shoulders. I read the speech, I read the offending paragraph, and the president said, well, what do you think, Ken? And I said, I think it's a hell of a speech, it's a hell of a paragraph. You're the president, you get to decide. But the State Department objects.
Tomorrow, President Reagan goes on to West Berlin, where he'll visit the Berlin Wall, and today...
Right before the speech, we went to the Berlin Wall, and I remember Reagan looking at all the crosses painted on the wall, and Reagan saying, this is the only wall that's ever been built to keep people in, not keep people out. We're driving to the Brandenburg Gate, and he turned to me and he said, it's going to drive those State Department boys crazy, but I'm going to leave in the line. And 20 minutes later, the signature line of President Reagan's 8 years.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I was standing off on the side, and I remember looking out in the audience of hundreds of thousands of people and having chills up and down my spine. But standing there, you had a sense that we were going to win. The wall was going to come down, and Reagan and America would prevail.
I'm going to take a wild guess that George Shultz had a different reaction.
No, he was okay because he had covered himself. It was on my shoulders, not his.
He was on there. So I guess the question after watching that terrific scene, the question in my mind is, can the chief of staff change the course of history? Do you think, for example, do you think it's a coincidence that Iran-Contra happened on Don Regan's watch instead of James Baker's watch? Maybe you guys could talk a little bit about that.
Chiefs of staff get engaged in different policy at the White House. They don't get engaged in every policy at the White House because you run out of time. I do think that Don Regan, when he was chief of staff, was predisposed not to be as engaged in some of the foreign policy, national security discussions as he was the economic policy discussions. He'd been the Secretary of the Treasury. And so I think that lack of interest, and it wasn't the absence of interest, but it was a lack of interest, invited a climate where the NSC crowd kind of went off and did their own thing. I don't think James A. Baker III would have had a lack of interest in doing that. So I think he would have been engaged and probably spotted and said, what are you thinking? But yes, I do think a chief of staff, without an expectation, may influence history, but I don't think that they take the responsibility to make history. In fact, most of us took the job to guarantee that we wouldn't be part of history except to have our name on the roll. Right. So we're not looking to be the players. I think as soon as a chief of staff tries to become the player or a significant player, they're diminished in their opportunity to allow the White House to function as a president expects that it should. And that's, remember, a chief of staff serves the president and the first lady, and really nobody else. We help the personification of Article 2 in the Constitution. That's the role of a chief of staff.
On that note, I think it's time now to take questions from our audiences, both here in the Rudman Center and at Dartmouth College in Hanover. It's my pleasure to introduce Dean Lacey on our screen here, Professor of Government and Director of the Program on Government and Law at Dartmouth College. Professor Lacey, I pass it over to you, after which we'll take questions from our audience here at the Rudman Center.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to the Rudman Center. Thank you to the University of New Hampshire. I'm glad we're hosting these events, not least of which because I have 2 daughters who are now students at UNH. We have a number of anxious questions from our audience here at Dartmouth. The first is from a student, Chris Calkins, who has a question for the Chiefs.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. My question is, I would really like to hear a little bit more about those first days, weeks, months in the job, because you've all spoken about how you really can't have an idea for how demanding this job is until you're in it. So what were those first days and moments like?
Well, again, I think it depends. It's a very good question. Depends on what time of the presidency that you have the privilege to serve as chief of staff. Of course, Andy served going in. Ken served the vital last 2 years of President Reagan. Again, I came in at the beginning of President Clinton's administration. So I think the real challenge there is you have so many priorities that have to be addressed. The first overriding premise is you have to shift from the campaign to governing. Very different point in time. And what worked on the campaign trail won't necessarily work very well in the White House.
Amen.
Secondly, in our case, as I noted before, but it can't be emphasized enough, you have to get a government in place. You have to get your cabinet selected and confirmed. You have to get your sub-cabinet people in office and so forth. Thirdly, you have a lot of people who think they just may be the most important person in the world for the President of the United States. Whether it's a member, Chris, of the Distinguished Press Corps, a member of Congress, a world leader, or someone who singularly, Terry, helped President Clinton get there. So you had all of these constituencies that you were dealing with. Finally, in our case, we had to introduce President Bill Clinton to the world and world leaders who had not been a senator, had traveled some internationally, had studied abroad, but that's, of course, crucial. So you have all of these constituencies, but finally, I would say, particularly after that poignant, moving scene from 9/11 that we all remember so well, even in 1992, when you get that security briefing at Blair House before the president is sworn in, as Andy and Ken remember so well, there was no question in our minds that the most sacred responsibility for the Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America is the protection and the security of the American people. And so that is a fundamental guiding principle. So all of those things were certainly high priorities, Chris, when we came in. And of course, it was about the economy. We had to get our economic deficit reduction plan passed.
When I came back to the White House, I had served in the first term running President Reagan's legislative affairs program during the successful fights with Tip O'Neill and winning the budget stuff and the tax reductions and the defense buildup. And I left after the first term. I came back in the depths of Iran-Contra. So walking into it, I knew that Ronald Reagan was at 37% in the polls. People were saying he wasn't simply a lame duck. Virtually, he was a dead duck. And our job was to help the president rebuild his presidency so the last 2 years could be among the best 2 years. And we set about not only to rebuild his confidence, but also to get major legislative achievements, to demonstrate to the country and the world that he was still on top. We did 2 summit meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev, a strategic arms treaty, not only adopted but ratified by the United States Senate, by the way, in Democratic hands for the first time in the Reagan presidency, a welfare reform bill, an immigration reform bill, the Canada Free Trade Agreement, and oh yes, we helped Andy get George Herbert Walker Bush elected president. Not bad for a B-movie actor. And he left office at 68%. But walking in there, in those initial months, we were trying to figure out how to deal with Iran-Contra and start setting up the priorities for the president for his last 2 years. And I would only say to you that one of the people most helpful to us, but very difficult to deal with and very tough on us when we first walked in, was Warren Rudman. And he kept explaining to me, I'm knocking the hell out of the president every day in the Iran-Contra hearings, but if I decide he's telling the truth, I'll be your strongest, best advocate. And when he became convinced that, in fact, Ronald Reagan was telling the truth, and Howard Baker and I and Frank Carlucci and Colin Powell all agreed that Reagan had been telling the truth, Warren Rudman was our strongest advocate. That was all coming back here in those initial months.
There are several chapters to the book of the presidency, and the first chapter is probably the most anticipated chapter because it comes right after an election. And therefore, presidents are attracting lots of people who will help them decide what to do in their first chapter. And that's a transition team. And I was involved in a transition team coming into the White House when President Reagan left and George H.W. Bush took over. And yes, Graham Hollings was part of the learn what to do and how to do it. But we had a vice president who was becoming president, so his transition was relatively easy to anticipate. I was in charge of the complete transition of President Bush number 41 leaving office and passing the baton to President Clinton. A very different environment. However, it is a hallmark of our democracy that no former presidents want the current president to drop the baton once they get it.
Right.
So we worked very hard to make sure that President Clinton would have everything he needed to be president on day one. Not day 23, but day one. President Clinton, I guarantee, had a game plan that his team put together and said, this is what we'd like to do. When I was involved in a transition coming in with President Bush 43, he had a plan. However, we didn't have as much time to produce the plan because the election was decided by a Supreme Court. And so the transition period was a lot shorter. But we still had a 100-day plan. Almost every president has a 100-day plan. And you hope things go according to plan. They don't. The Chinese decided to take a plane down on Hainan Island. It was an American plane, and it created a diplomatic furor, and the Chinese weren't answering the phone when we call. So things happen, and you have to be nimble. But yes, there is a plan. You'd like to stick as close as possible to the plan, but the president's ultimate job is, just as Mack said, it's to keep the oath of office. It's not to keep the campaign promises. The oath of office is the burden the president carries. And interestingly, the president can't keep his oath of office without a lot of other people keeping their oaths.
Sure.
And it ends up people who take an oath because they put a uniform on, and they take a second oath. The first one is protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And lots of people take that. Members of Congress, anybody in the military, they take that oath. Any White House staffer takes that oath. The president's oath is a little bit different because he has to preserve. He's got a bigger job. But the one that puts the burden on the president is the people who take the oath that they will follow the command of the commander-in-chief. And the president can't keep his oath without them, and some of them make sacrifices that he would never invite on anybody. That becomes the greatest burden, and that's something that you don't understand until you take the oath of president. And that's not part of the transition process. It's on day one.
As you said, that from one president to another, you don't want to see the baton dropped. I hope you also appreciate that from one White House chief of staff to another, we are a fraternity maybe someday soon a sorority, but as well, but a fraternity that we all are invested in each other's success. And we don't want anybody to drop the baton.
We all heard from Dennis McDonough within the last week.
Right, exactly.
All right, Ken, you went there, so I have to ask you, why in the world has there not been a female chief of staff?
Beats the hell out of me. But I think soon, one way or the other.
Mack?
There has been on television, but not in the real world, and that won't quite
Well,
work.
as you mentioned that, I can't remember her name. I just lost Allison Janney in West Wing. Went from being press secretary to being chief of staff. And one of my responsibilities when I was doing the consulting was for West Wing, was giving her the confidence so she could be the actress to play chief of staff because she thought it was too daunting.
I have a West Wing story, too. Leo was the chief of staff.
Right.
Leo, the chief of staff, John Spencer. And I am a relatively new chief of staff to the President of the United States, and I get invited to an event in Washington, D.C., at the Marriott Hotel, black tie, formal affair. I had to give a speech and present some awards to career government employees from CDC and NIH and whatever. So I have a policy-oriented speech. I'm going to this event. I arrive, and the advanced team has got the doors all open for me, and it was very nice. And the woman greets me from the event organizing committee, and she says, "Oh, it's so good to see you. The chief of staff is here." And I'm thinking to myself, the chief of staff? She doesn't know it. And she says, "Oh, you've got to come meet him." So, I'm excited. I go to the holding room, and I walk in, and there is John Spencer, the chief of staff, Leo, the chief of staff from the television show The West Wing. And I am not a man of stature, and I'm also not tall. John Spencer was shorter than I am, and I have a type A personality. He did not.
Right.
So the conversation was strained. And he would say, "What's it like to be the president's chief of staff?" And I said, "Oh, boy, I tell you, it's unbelievable. It's really no description to it. What's it like to play the chief of staff?" He said, "We have to understand, I have a script. I know where to stand. I know what to do." And I said, "Whoa, I have no script. People do tell me where to stand every once in a while." And then he had lots of little tiny questions about it, but then he kind of got silent. And then he said, "Can I ask you a personal question?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Because I get this question all the time." But he said, "What does a chief of staff make?"
Right.
I said, "I'm a public employee. It's published in the Washington Post. You can find out." And I said, $142,000, which is what it was at the time. And he looks at me and he says, "Is that per episode?" I said, "It's per annum." And he says, "How do you function?"
Right.
You don't do it for the money.
Right. Oh, man.
Do we have another question from Hanover?
We do have another question from a Dartmouth student, Abi Parajuli.
So how often do you gauge public opinion, and to what extent does that drive your agenda?
Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question.
President Reagan, under the Reagan administration, we polled once a month, which sounds like ancient history now. We polled not to figure out where to go, because Reagan had his own philosophy and what he was willing to fight for, but to see whether or not he was resonating with the American people. So we used polls in a very limited fashion. If I am not mistaken, they now poll every day and do overnights every night.
Mack,
what
is
about
for me to answer that question first?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll finish it up.
During the Bush administration, we did not poll that often. We polled about the same level as the Reagan administration. During President George W. Bush's tenure, there was a lot more polling being done in the political climate.
Right.
And it actually grew dramatically during the Clinton years. So there was polling. What I tried to do is not allow the president to be engaged with what the polls said. and he didn't need to know. And quite frankly, I tried to make sure that there wasn't a lot of discussion about the polling. We did not poll over what language to use or how to use it or what policies to make, but we did poll to find out what reaction was to policy or expectations. But it was nowhere near as driving as the myth, and I can't speak to how driving it is in today's world at the White House, but it was. I didn't worry about the polls too much. I worried about the president doing the right thing, and I think the president worried about doing the right thing. I can't think of one time where I felt he made a decision because of the polls. So I don't think that he was ever conscious of trying to make a decision that would satisfy the pollsters, if you will.
I always made sure that when Dick Worthland came in once every 6 weeks, that he met with me first, so I could figure out what he was going to present to the president.
Andy, was that the case with Karl Rove, or did Karl go into the Oval whenever he felt like?
Karl is a diseased man. He eats, sleeps, and breathes the political climate in America, and there are always people around a White House that do that. But I will say this. Karl Rove did not involve himself in the policy aspects of the debate as being manipulated by the polls. He was very good at anticipating how the public would react to things, but it wasn't that policy was driven to satisfy a poll direction. It was more, what are the consequences of action? So my conscience is clear in how Karl Rove practiced his art, and it's the art of politics. It's not the science of politics. You should never be taking political science. It's the art of politics. And I also feel strongly that Karl Rove, because of your perception of him, should not have been involved in debates centering around national security issues, and he wasn't, contrary to the myth. He was not part of the national security infrastructure. He was involved when the national security team had policies that were made, and how would we communicate those policies and when. But he wasn't involved in the policies themselves.
Well, quickly to sum up on polls, it would have been an exercise in futility to tell President Clinton not to be mindful of the polls. Given his political acumen, that was just part of his personality and his DNA. Having said that, clearly the world has changed so dramatically from the time we were in the White House or President Reagan or President Bush 43 in terms of information flow and polling. We would do it about once a month. I followed basically the same point that Ken did. Stan Greenberg initially would come to me and we'd present it, and he would go to President Clinton. Having said that, I think each of us can cite instances, whether in our case it was the Mexico support package, where initially we were going to have congressional support. Somehow that support evaporated when the polls came out 85-15 not to do it, or the Kosovo initiative, where the polls were overwhelmingly against our Kosovo policy, Ambassador Holbrooke initially, when we first started. So I think every president has to be mindful of public standing. You can't just completely be unmindful of where the people of this country are if you're President of the United States. On the other hand, there clearly comes times and places where you have to make a decision, and the right decision does not square up with the polls at that particular point in time.
Do we have another question from Hanover?
We do have one more question for you. Thanks for letting us join you this afternoon.
It seems that the Chief of Staff has to gain expertise quickly in a very changing environment. I wonder if you could speak to the psychology and the habits that you have to have in order to A, actualize the decisions of a president, and then B, articulate stakeholders' concerns to the leader of the free world.
Who would like to take that on?
Well, I think
we'll switch the order.
Okay, I'll quickly respond. I think first of all, you have to have the trust of the president, and people have to know that. That's not necessarily an attribute, but I think it's a prerequisite for a successful and effective chief of staff. I think secondly, you have to have a measure of confidence and trust by those you're dealing with, whether it be members of Congress, foreign governments, or whatever, or you're not going to be able to communicate. And so I think a hallmark, and get things done, I think a hallmark is that relationship. Thirdly, I think the more transparency, inclusiveness you can have in decisions within reason, the better off you're going to be. Now, you can't open it up too wide, but I think if people feel like you're being, frankly, clever by the proverbial half, or worse, manipulative and disingenuous, you just won't get anywhere as a chief of staff.
I believe the chief of staff should have pretty broad peripheral vision, knowing that most of the people who work at the White House are hired because they have unbelievably good tunnel vision. So there are experts at the White House. And the chief of staff's job is understand the context of a problem and then find the people with the tunnel vision to offer solutions, but they shouldn't just be one person. It's going to be, you don't want the president getting monolithic counsel. So you have to make sure you identify a number of people with outstanding tunnel vision in those areas of interest. And yes, you have to climb a pretty steep learning curve. And you have to be knowledgeable, and you have to make sure the president has a chance to be knowledgeable. But the president cannot be bullied in the process. So you kind of are like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You've got to pay attention to the porridge. Is it too hot, too cold, or just right? And it's got to be at the right time. You don't want the president to make a decision so early that it's irrelevant by the time it's implemented. You certainly don't want to make it too late because it is irrelevant. So the calendar, the clock, the cadence of the world, the cadence of America, the cadence of the Congress plays a big role in the peripheral vision as to when things should happen.
And Ken, correct me if I'm wrong, but Jack Watson famously called you the javelin catchers.
Yeah, chief javelin catcher.
Chief javelin catchers. You've got a target on your front and on your back, right?
It's better than having it on the president's front or back. That's what your job is. Your job is to take the javelins that are aimed at the president. But listening to Mack and Andy, I couldn't help but think that our jobs were to also explain to the president what the art of the possible was.
No question.
Andy said so many people in the White House staff have tunnel vision. They're experts in this and this and this. I would not say that the three of us are experts in anything. But we understand what good governing is and getting to solutions and getting to yes on behalf of our president. That's what the job is all about. And if you have to take some javelins in the meantime, so be it. But look, there were times where President Reagan was being opportune to do this or to do that. And I would have to say, that sounds good, but we don't have the votes. Or the American people aren't sold on that idea. Remember, the job of president is to build consensus in America or in the world, not in Washington. If you get consensus in America, Washington will follow. That's the hallmark of the communications function called the President of the United States.
Mack?
Well, just quickly, the characteristics, I would say, are order and flexibility. You're doing your best to maintain order, be on message, move your priorities, but you've got to remain flexible and nimble because inevitably you're going to have unforeseen occurrences come into the presidency. So I think that's two of the key characteristics responding to the question.
You can be a javelin catcher, but you also have to be a butterfly catcher.
I do feel that a chief of staff has to be comfortable in their insecurity. Because you serve at the pleasure of the president for the time being. There is no tenure, and you don't get a gold watch when you leave. So you have to pay attention to the responsibilities of the day rather than worrying about your job security for tomorrow. And that insecurity is a very good thing, especially if you make sure that others who serve the president understand their insecure relationship with the president. And they should never do their job looking for security. They just have to do their job to help the president. But if the president loses confidence in them, it's time for them to go. The time arrived. And that's okay, because the White House is one of the few places in the world where you can say, wow, thank you for yesterday, it was great.
I think we have time for one more from Hanover, if you have another.
Do we have another question? Well, let me ask you one. Several of you have mentioned the importance of the media and the media cycle in policymaking. Were there certain media outlets that you were more sensitive to? Those that were on your side, those that were usually against you, or there some that you thought had a better sense of public opinion than others?
All of the above.
We didn't find too many that were on our side.
There was always an adversarial relationship. You have to understand that.
Tension.
But the cute story, if you're old enough at Dartmouth to remember this, that President Reagan always used to stop to take the shouted questions of Sam Donaldson or Bill Plant or Andrea Mitchell.
Mostly Sam.
Mostly Sam. And he often did it on his way to the helicopter to go to Camp David for the weekend. You never want to put the president in a position of lying. President Reagan infamously used to say, "But Sam, I can't hear you." Those are the days that we didn't want him to answer any questions. So there was a phone in the diplomatic reception room that you can call the helicopter pilot on Marine One and say, "Start the engines." The president did not lie. "Sam, I can't hear you." In a forum similar to this, I told that story with Sam on the panel. I cannot repeat his response.
There has been an irreversible change in the dynamics of communication in Washington, D.C. When I first went to Washington, we got our news from NBC, CBS, and ABC, Reuters, UPI, AP. And we got our news, and then we formed our opinion. Today, we wake up with an opinion, and we selectively choose our outlet, Fox, MSNBC. We go to our favorite blog, we go to our favorite website, and our opinion gets reinforced. So we know we were right when we woke up. And judgment doesn't play a role in our dialogue. That is impacting Washington dramatically. So the relationship with the press is nowhere near what it was like when I first went to Washington today. The press now works more on emotion and generating, I'm going to say, opportunities for eyeballs and passion with an attention deficit disorder nation. So they're looking to alert us. No, headline. We're told all the time, we pay attention, pay attention. And so judgment frequently is not part of the political process today. Emotions become more dominant, and polarization is then invited. So I think there's a very different dynamic today than it was when I first went to Washington, D.C.
And one important additional point, I think it's not only changed so dramatically, which the students here understand better than any of us on this panel, maybe save Chris, but it's also changed the international landscape and how communication and how you deal with international issues, because it's so instantaneous. Secretary Christopher, who had served in the Carter administration, made that observation early on in our administration in 1993, and obviously the world has changed dramatically since then.
You know, it's interesting. When there were the riots in Tahrir Square in Cairo, several of the cable stations were broadcasting live. And one of the distressing moments for me was to see a protester who the TV cameras knew nothing about, arguing about why Mubarak should go and what was wrong with the United States support of Mubarak. And I think it was Jay Carney, the White House press secretary at the time, answering what the protester was saying. Is that how we make American foreign policy? Answering a protester who we don't know anything about and being answered in the press office of the President of the United States? That's not a way to make policy, but that's the requirement of TV today.
Just want to thank our friends in Hanover for the very good questions, and let me just throw out a question that's from our audience here. What was it like leaving the White House after the pressure cooker that you lived through? Rahm Emanuel told us that it was like re-entry without a heat shield. Tell us about that. Ken?
I went on to Maui for a vacation after dropping the Reagans in California. And when I came back, I arrived back in Dulles Airport, and my bags were ripped. And my wife at the time said, "Welcome back to the private sector." The other part, I would say, is when we dropped the Reagans in L.A., I realized that Nancy Reagan was very tearful. And when I got to the hotel that I was going to stay out for the night, I called Nancy and said, "How would you and the president like to go out and have dinner? I don't want you to be alone on your first night." And Nancy started crying. And she got back on the phone and said, "Ronnie says, come for dinner tomorrow night." One day, you're the President of the United States, and the next day, you're reading on boxes, seated on boxes, eating takeout food. You want to talk about a leveling experience? But the story that I think you want me to tell, knowing Chris, is the story of when George Herbert Walker Bush was sworn in and inaugurated. We left the Capitol grounds by helicopter, and every president in good weather takes a ceremonial trip around Washington. And as we got over the White House, President Reagan looked down and then tapped Nancy on her knee and said, "Look, dear, there's our little bungalow." The end of the Reagan presidency was that moment because everybody on Marine One teared up. That's going into the private sector and ending a president.
Ken had the luxury of ending when a president's tenure ended. Mack and I did not have that luxury. But you do serve at the pleasure of the president for the time being. That's the double insecurity that comes with the opportunity. But you also have the reality of getting burnt out. It is not a job. It's a commitment. And the commitment is 24/7, and the burdens are much greater than even we've discussed here.
Right.
And sometimes you have to leave because you have to leave. I don't know anybody who wanted to leave the White House. They had to leave for some reason. It could be personal, it could be because the president said they had to leave, but they had to leave. But they would love to have stayed under different circumstances. Can I just work an 8-hour day? Or could I have a little bit more money?
I'll take 15.
No, but nobody wants to leave. It's a special place. But I did find the burden after I left was I had the benefit of knowing too much when I was there and knowing nothing when I left. So I would wake up in the morning as chief of staff and I'd read the newspapers and I would say, they don't have it quite right. I can tell who's spinning, or I could anticipate this. They don't have it quite right. And that was any news outlet. So this is not aimed at any one particular outlet. I didn't see anybody get it right because I kind of knew more. And that's not arrogance, it's just the reality of the job. I left office. I pick up the newspaper and I read it and I said, I know they don't have it right, but I don't know why. And that became a great burden. And yes, it took me months, if not years, to get over that. So I missed it.
You also had the benefit of the PDB.
The PDB,
the president's
great document. You all want to see it, but it's not as good as the myth.
Right. But it's good. Yeah. And you missed that too.
3 quick points, Chris. Number one, I had a pretty natural and pretty easy exit from the White House after 6.5 years because I had just completed a field that I was fortunate to have the opportunity to serve after Chief of Staff in the international side, the Second Summit of the Americas, and that was kind of a natural concluding point for me. So it was a pretty easy, natural, graceful exit in that regard. Secondly, I had come from the private sector as a business person, so I was returning to that world. Thirdly, however, it dawned on me pretty quickly that I was the youngest person in most meetings I had attended before I served in the White House. Very fortunate to have opportunities at an early age. And somehow when I left the White House, I found I was the oldest person in most meetings. And that was between 46 and 52 and a half. Well, the world had changed. And I think one relevant point, you talk about the Clinton White House had a lot of young people and so forth. Every White House has had a lot of young people. The Kennedy White House, the Johnson White House. It's, in many cases, a young person's field. But that was a big change as well as the world changing. The final point I would make in terms of exiting the White House, I think we've seen a remarkable phenomenon in our country with post-president activities and impact in the world, with President Carter, with President Bush 43, with President Clinton, with President Ford and President Reagan, and I think we'll continue to see that. So those would be the three observations that I would make, but I had a pretty natural time in my case, which obviously I was grateful for.
Excellent. Let's bring this up to present day. A month from now, we've got a big election. The Senate may go Republican, maybe by a seat. In any event, a rocky road ahead for the current president. If you were in Dennis McDonough's shoes,
I'd leave. No.
If you were in Dennis McDonough's shoes, the current chief, what would you be telling the president?
Do your job, keep your oath, focus on what is right, protect America, and that's the real job of the president. So read the Constitution again. Article 2 describes the job. It doesn't say anything about immigration, doesn't say anything about Social Security, doesn't say about education, doesn't say anything about taxes. It says preserve, protect, and defend. And do that to the extent that you can, number one. And yes, work for what you want to, but don't abrogate your responsibilities to do what you have to. And always lead. The one thing that I feel strongly about is the President of the United States should always be the leader, whether it's dealing with Congress, dealing with the executive branch of government that cries out for leadership, but certainly with international leaders around the world, friend and foe, and neutrals. So that would be my advice to Dennis McDonough. Don't worry about polls, popularity. Don't even worry about the reorganization of Congress to the extent that you're not willing to get your hands dirty, because I think to get something done in Congress, the president has to be engaged in Congress, which means you have to get down into the machinery of Congress to show an interest and give passion, cover, momentum, and I'm going to say success. And if you can't do that, don't get your hands dirty, because they will get dirty if you go up there, but I would say get your hands dirty, but protect us first. That's the job.
Mack, you've said that there are cycles to a presidency, and we're clearly headed into a new one.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I might take a little different view than Andy, not dramatically. I would certainly concur with him in terms of the security aspect. I think the president's got to be even more proactive, more forward-leaning on the international front. I think he's beginning to build some bipartisan consensus here in our country, both in the Congress and more broadly, to do that. I think he's got to continue to build coalitions around the world. That would be my first counsel to him. The second counsel I would say, depending on how the congressional elections come out, is look, we've got 18 months here. Lame ducks can still fly. If you look at each of these presidencies, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Ronald Reagan got a lot done in the last 18 months of their presidency. So it's absolutely essential to try to change that dynamic. I think you can do it on trade. I think you can do it on tax reform. I think you can possibly do it on immigration reform. Try to get some progress. To me, that's what the American people want to see in Washington. And then try to hand that baton off to the next swimmer, the next president, whether it be Republican or Democrat, to go forward.
All of those presidencies did those things with a change in the chief of staff, yes?
They did. Yeah. They did. I'm not sure that was key in some of them it was.
Ken?
You know, every two-term president since President Eisenhower has gone into a ditch in his second term. Every one of the presidents stopped digging the ditch and was able to rely on trusted relationships, not only around the world, but also with Congress. Sadly, I say that this president doesn't have many trusting relationships on Capitol Hill. I think if I were advising Dennis, advising the president, number one, I would argue that you need some fresh voices people with renewed energy, because as Andy said, or Mack said, both, people get burnt out in these jobs, in the White House jobs. I think you also need to start bringing in the cabinet officers who have something to play. This is such a White House-centric administration. Cabinet officers have a major role to play. They need to be brought into the process in more than a deputy level, at a high level, including advising the president.
And unusually, after the midterm elections of the last term of a president, the president has two opportunities to impact the relationship with Congress. The first is taking advantage of a lame duck session, and then building relationships for a relatively productive new session. And we don't know how the president will meet those two responsibilities, but they are very different. The lame duck session and then a new session that takes their office in January, as Bill Zelliff knows.
I would argue very strongly that it is not too late to start building relationships on Capitol Hill, but it has to be a priority, and it has to be a total engagement, not just by the White House staff, but most importantly, by the president. I happen to be of the view that the list that Mack just used of tax reform, of trade, and of immigration would be easier to accomplish if the Republicans controlled the Senate and if Obama was willing to engage. So far, he has not been willing to compromise. He has not been willing to lead when it comes to Congress. Look, every president goes through a period where dealing with the Congress is worse than 10 root canals. But it's a means to an end. And the means to an end is getting some legislative successes. Nothing will be better for President Obama or for a Republican Senate to demonstrate to the American people an ability to govern, to get some stuff done. We've been gridlocked for too long, but our system of government requires strong presidential leadership. Congress cannot lead that way. The president has to.
We're getting close to the end of our time here, and I just want to ask each of you to reflect on Warren Rudman, if you would. Just some final thoughts about him.
I did not have the opportunity to work with Senator Rudman as Ken and Andy had, but I noted in my opening comments what struck you most in looking at his career, which I had the opportunity to do as a private citizen and working in government, was his ferocious integrity. He clearly personified the values, the characteristics of New Hampshire and this part of our wonderful country. But in talking to David Pryor, who's been a longtime friend who served with Senator Rudman on the Ethics Committee for 11 years in the Senate, he was a protector of the institution. He went the long mile to keep the Senate intact in some very tumultuous, difficult, contentious issues on the Ethics Committee. And I think finally, as someone who is such a strong believer in bipartisanship, being in the center, looking for the right way to do something, to me just personifies the hallmark of a leader that's carried on in this institution. That's why I considered it a privilege when Ken and I visited to come and participate in this program along with Andy and Ken.
Well, I had the benefit of admiring Warren Rudman from Massachusetts. And so I got to see the campaign commercials when he first ran for office. And I was introduced to him that way. And I saw the integrity that he had as a politician. Now I know nobody likes to use that term. It's the most noble term in a democracy. And Warren Rudman answered the noble call. And he stood tall and he ran and he won. But he served nobly. He didn't just run nobly, he served nobly. And I was a witness to that because he didn't serve as a partisan. He understood partisanship. He actually respected partisanship. So it wasn't that he was running against partisanship. He respected it. But he served to build coalitions that could make a difference. He was definitely someone who was willing to fight for perfection, but have the courage to work for perfectly good. And that is a courage that we need more of in Washington, D.C. today. In fact, we need more within the electorate today. We have to bring your passion to the debate for your version of perfection, but find the courage to work for perfectly good. Otherwise, you will become irrelevant. And we have a lot of irrelevant people in Congress right now.
On both sides of the aisle.
On both sides of the aisle. On both sides of the aisle. But Senator Rudman really personified what I think our founding fathers thought a senator should be. He actually represented New Hampshire, not just elements in New Hampshire. And he was proud of it. He also brought with him the courage to stand up to a president, even if they were of the same party, and say, I don't like what you're doing, I think you should try something else. And he introduced a president to a Supreme Court justice who served quite nobly for New Hampshire. And that introduction wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Warren Rudman. So I'm a witness to what happened, in addition to the outstanding policy conscience that he gave Congress by being part of Gray and Rudman Hollings that says, we can't keep spending the way we're spending. We're going to have to bring some discipline. And so his contributions are still very, very significant, and they make a difference, and I'm proud to be here. But I was nowhere near as close a friend to Warren Rudman as Ken Duberstein was, and so Ken.
Well, Warren had the probably most famous middle name in American history, Rudman. Graham Rudman Hollings. I benefited from my long friendship with Warren because he helped me understand even better the institution of the Senate and the importance of governing. We argued, we fought, and we always came to the right conclusion. One of the little-known facts is in the waning days of the Reagan administration, when Robert Bork's nomination went down, and then Doug Ginsburg withdrew his nomination, and the president had settled on Anthony Kennedy. Warren called me just a bit too late to tell me he wanted to introduce me to David Souter. And he made the introduction even though it was too late in the process for President Reagan. On the day that David Souter was nominated for the bench, Warren and I happened to both be in New York at a same meeting, and we flew up on a shuttle, and we heard that the president was going to announce a decision that afternoon. Warren did not know, nor I, whether it was going to be David Souter or somebody else. We got on the shuttle, or we got to the terminal at LaGuardia. We couldn't get a payphone. Cells weren't working very well in those days. We flew back looking at each other saying, I wonder what's going to happen. When I got on the ground, we got on the ground at LaGuardia, my beeper went off. Remember, we used to carry beepers. And it said, call your office immediately. And I called, and the message was, call the White House and be in John Sununu's office in an hour. And I turned to Warren, and he said, I'm on the phone with my office. I think it's David, but I'm not sure. And I went directly to the White House. By that time, the president had announced David, and I called Warren from John's office. And he had already gotten a phone call, perhaps from you, Andy, or from the president.
John Sununu.
From John Sununu. And there were tears in both of our eyes. And we worked together, me as the outside Sherpa, and him as David's person in the United States Senate. And if I'm not mistaken, the vote was 97-0.
Ken helped organize the votes.
But David is a legacy of Warren Rudman. And I think all of us who believe so strongly in governing and in the institution of the old Senate owe a big debt of gratitude, not only to Warren, but to all of you in New Hampshire for electing him so many times. You know, I was up in the Senate not long ago, and as I walked into the Capitol, I ran into some of the senators leaving from a vote. And I stopped and I looked up and I said, where have all the Warren Rudmans gone? We could use a hell of a lot more Warren Rudmans today. So I thank you very, very much for this opportunity for the three of us to share, and Chris, our insights with you today. But we all did it because of our friendship and our devotion to the ideals of governing and to everything that Warren Rudman stood for. So thank you all very, very much.